Hey guys, today we're diving into another truly horrifying case. If you want to support my channel, make sure to subscribe and stay active. It really helps me out. I'd be super grateful for that. Let's get started. Violent crimes tend to spark widespread public interest and quickly become surrounded by rumors and speculation. Investigations conducted in the immediate aftermath often have a higher chance of solving the case quickly. Close attention to details is crucial, but sometimes the most important clues come from the most unexpected places. In the spring of 2010, a small town in Illinois was shaken by the news of a brutal triple crime. The victims were 2 men and 1 woman, all members of the same family. The Kramer family was well off and well known in the local community, which led investigators to initially consider the possibility of a robbery that spiraled out of control. However, as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the situation was far more complex, tangled, and unpredictable than anyone could have imagined. Lori and Jeffrey Kramer had known each other since high school, and for years they were close friends. By their senior year, a romance blossomed between them, and as soon as they turned 18, they got married and never looked back. Not long after tying the knot, the young couple decided to leave the chaos of the big city behind and settle down in a quiet town called Darien, located in DuPage County, Illinois, just southwest of Chicago, with a population of just over 20,000. In 1986, they welcomed their first child, a son they named Anthony. 2 years later, their daughter Angela was born. Then, in the early 90s, their youngest, Michael, joined the family. Each of them had been longed for, and they were raised with care and love. Lori and Jeffrey were devoted parents who ensured their children had everything they needed and access to quality education. Back in the mid-1980s, Jeffrey opened a small auto repair shop in Darien, where he worked on cars and motorcycles with his own 2 hands. He quickly earned a reputation as someone who could fix just about anything, and word about his skills spread fast throughout the area. The business grew steadily. Over the years, that little shop expanded into a large service center that attracted customers from all over the county. The Kramers eventually bought a spacious house in one of the town's safest and most sought-after neighborhoods. Each family member had their own vehicle, the kids attended top-tier schools, and they all had the freedom to pursue whatever paths they chose without pressure from their parents. Anthony, the oldest, was studying economics and dreamed of moving to Chicago. He valued his independence but decided not to move out. Instead, he transformed the basement into his private living space, designing and renovating it himself. It had its own bathroom, kitchen, and a large bedroom. The only access, however, was still through the main house. Angela was studying architecture and was also considering relocating to a bigger city, though she still lived at home for the time being. Michael had just graduated high school and planned to stay in Darien to work alongside his father. He had grown up helping out at the repair shop, loved working with vehicles, had a good grasp of how they worked, and hoped to carry on the family business. So, even as young adults, all 3 Kramer children continued to live under one roof with their parents. The Kramers were known as a close-knit and genuinely happy family. They rarely argued and were always there for one another. Neighbors described them as warm, approachable, and generous, always ready to lend a hand. From the outside, it looked like they had no enemies and were respected and well-liked by everyone around them. But things weren't as perfect as they seemed. On March 2nd, 2010, around 2:30 in the morning, emergency services in Darien received a frantic call from a young woman. She was whispering, begging for help, for herself and her loved ones. Her voice trembled with fear, and it was hard to make out what she was saying. As authorities later learned, the caller had hidden herself inside a closet and had no idea what exactly was happening in the house, only that she had heard gunshots, at least 10 of them. Her words were scattered, but she managed to give an address and urged the dispatcher to send help as quickly as possible. That address belonged to the Kramer family. When officers arrived on the scene, there were no more gunshots, but the lights inside the house were still on. The first thing they noticed was someone climbing out through a basement window. At first, it seemed like it might be the perpetrator trying to escape, but it turned out to be the Kramers' oldest son, Anthony. He had also heard the gunfire and stayed hidden, unsure of what to do next. When he heard the approaching sirens, he decided to get out, but was too afraid to go through the house, worried he might encounter the person responsible. so instead, he escaped through the basement window. Officers moved Anthony to a safe distance and asked him to wait while they searched the house. The front door hadn't been forced open, and once the officers stepped inside, they immediately found a man lying on the stairs in a large pool of blood. It was Jeffrey Kramer, the head of the household. He had been struck twice in the chest at close range and was already gone. Just above him, lying on the steps, was the body of his wife, Lori. She had sustained wounds to the abdomen and head and showed no signs of life. Farther down the hallway, near the open door to the garage, face down in another pool of blood, was a young man. It was Michael, the youngest of the Kramer sons. He had been shot 3 times in the back. When first responders reached him, he still had a faint pulse, but unfortunately, he didn't survive the trip to the hospital and passed away in the ambulance. Multiple bullet holes were visible in the wall near the stairs, and large caliber shell casings were scattered across the floor. In the living room, a window had been shattered, most likely how the intruder or intruders entered the home. But one major question remained. Where was the young woman who had made the emergency call? Was she safe? Was she even still alive? Angela was found upstairs, still hiding inside a closet, paralyzed by shock. She had to be escorted out of the house, walking past the bodies of her family members, and broke down completely. She screamed and sobbed uncontrollably. Before officers could speak with her, she needed medical attention. The only known witnesses were the 2 surviving members of the Kramer family, but neither was able to provide much information. Anthony had been in his basement apartment when the shooting started. He had left his phone upstairs in the living room, so he couldn't call for help. Terrified of running into the shooter, he stayed hidden until he heard police sirens. Angela had been asleep in her room when the attack began. At the sound of gunfire, she ran toward her parents' bedroom but didn't find them there. Then more shots rang out. She grabbed her phone, hid inside a closet, and called for help. She stayed hidden until officers found her. Neither sibling had seen who was behind the attack. They couldn't say how many people were involved or provide any kind of description. The crime scene had very few clues left behind, aside from the shell casings. From the very beginning, the investigation was already hitting a wall. Detectives had no choice but to start considering every possible lead, even the ones that seemed the least likely at first glance. The Kramer family was well off and widely known throughout town. Their home contained many valuable and high-end items, which naturally raised the possibility of a break-in gone wrong. At first glance, this seemed like the most likely motive behind the crime. However, the scene inside the house didn't match that theory. Nothing appeared to be missing. Jewelry boxes, luxury watches, and high-end electronics were all left untouched and clearly visible. There were no signs of the place being ransacked, and the family's safe hadn't even been approached. According to statements from the surviving family members, the intruder was in the house for no more than 3 to 5 minutes. In other words, whoever committed this act entered the home by breaking a window in the living room, opened fire, took the lives of the homeowners and their youngest son, and then quickly fled, without stealing a single item. The whole scene suggested a personal motive. It appeared that someone in the family may have been targeted specifically, or possibly all of them were. This led law enforcement to take a closer look at the surviving family members, Angela and Anthony. Though both were adults, they still lived at home and didn't seem heavily involved in work. Their lifestyle was comfortable, supported by the success of their father's business. But investigators had to consider whether tensions might have grown within the household, tensions strong enough to lead to tragedy. One theory proposed by detectives was that the older siblings, possibly feeling stuck in a small town, had decided to take control of the family's assets, including a considerable amount of savings and the business itself. In this scenario, they would plan to sell the house and the auto shop, split the proceeds, and move on. Michael could have stood in the way, not only because he wanted to stay and work with his father, but also because fewer heirs meant a larger share for those left behind. As shocking as it sounded, that theory was eventually dismissed. Both Anthony and Angela were visibly devastated, deeply grieving the loss of their family. More importantly, the police suddenly received new information from someone who was not only a potential witness, but also became a key figure in the case. As the investigation was already in full swing, with officers examining the scene, interviewing the surviving relatives, and canvassing for any witnesses, A young woman approached the Kramer residence. She was visibly shaken, crying, and desperately asking about Michael. She said she had something important to report and that she had been in the house when everything happened. Her name was Samantha. She had just turned 19 and was Michael's girlfriend. The two had been high school sweethearts, and their relationship dated back to their teenage years. Their families supported them, and the couple had even begun talking about getting engaged in the near future. On the night of the incident, the Kramers had invited Samantha over for a family dinner. They enjoyed the evening together, and Samantha decided to stay the night with her boyfriend. Around 11 p.m., Jeffrey and Lori headed off to bed. Not long after, Angela and Anthony also went to their rooms. Michael and Samantha stayed behind in the living room, planning to watch a movie. But during the film, the two dozed off together on the couch. Around 2:30 in the morning, Samantha was jolted awake by the loud crash of shattering glass. At first, she didn't fully grasp what was happening and even thought the sound might have come from the movie they had been watching. Michael woke up too. The two looked around in confusion and saw a dark figure entering through a broken window. Samantha couldn't give any kind of description of the intruder. The person was dressed head to toe in black and wore a mask that completely hid their face. Suddenly, the unknown individual pulled out a handgun and fired in their direction while they were still sitting on the couch, frozen in fear. The bullet struck the wall near them. That was the moment they realized they had to run. They rushed toward the nearest exit, the door leading to the garage. Michael pushed it open and, shielding his girlfriend with his body, urged her through the doorway. That's when he was shot 3 times in the back at close range. But the few seconds he stood in the doorway were enough for Samantha to make it outside and take off running. In a state of shock, she believed Michael was right behind her and didn't immediately notice he wasn't. She ran several blocks without looking back, convinced the perpetrator was chasing her. Eventually, she stopped on a deserted street and looked around. No one was there. Her phone was still back in the Kramers' living room, so she tried to get help by knocking on the door of the first house she came across. But either the residents were away or asleep, because no one answered. Then she heard footsteps approaching. Terrified that the person behind the attack was following her, she crawled beneath a porch and hid. She stayed there for about an hour, too shaken to move. Eventually, still in shock, she decided to go back to Michael's house. From a distance, Samantha saw flashing red and blue lights from police cruisers and hurried toward them. Officers stopped her before she could enter the house, but she caught sight of the bodies inside. When she realized Michael was gone, she was devastated. Despite her grief, she quickly came under suspicion. Investigators briefly considered the possibility that someone infatuated with Samantha, perhaps a jealous admirer, had tried to eliminate Michael and targeted the others as witnesses, but that theory never led anywhere conclusive. The investigation shifted when Angela brought up a name during questioning. When asked if anyone might have held a grudge against the family, she unexpectedly mentioned Johnny Borisov, a former boyfriend she had broken up with in a heated argument just a couple of months earlier. The two shared a young son. Their relationship had been complex and emotional. Initially, Angela had been dating Johnny's best friend, Stephen, who tragically lost his life in a serious car crash along with his father about 3.5 years ago. In the aftermath, Johnny supported her, helped her through the grieving process, and over time, their friendship turned romantic. A year later, Angela became pregnant. She and Johnny decided to get married, and he moved into the Kramer family home. But as time went on, it became clear that Johnny had expected the relationship to offer him a life of comfort, without work. He relied heavily on the Kramers' financial support. He also had a short fuse, displayed manipulative tendencies, and struggled significantly with anger management. Johnny had been pressuring Angela to convince her parents to buy them a separate house. When that didn't happen, he started trying to stir up tension between her and the rest of the family. That kind of behavior is ultimately what led to the breakup. The couple never made it to the altar, and now the two young parents were going through a custody battle over their son. Interestingly, on the day of the incident, Johnny had picked up the boy and taken him to his parents' apartment, but didn't stay there himself. Johnny quickly became the primary suspect. He was brought in for questioning almost immediately. He certainly seemed to have a motive, but law enforcement still needed concrete evidence to prove he was involved. During interrogation, Johnny claimed he had been at a casino the entire night and hadn't left once. That alibi was later confirmed thanks to the venue's extensive surveillance footage, which showed him consistently throughout the night. Still, investigators weren't ready to rule him out. His behavior raised red flags. Something about it just didn't sit right. There was speculation that Johnny might not have been directly involved, but could have hired someone else to carry out the act. Given his motives and history, that theory seemed plausible. It also came to light that Johnny had previous run-ins with the law related to distributing banned substances. He had been arrested multiple times, but somehow always received light penalties or avoided serious consequences altogether. However, he had never been charged with anything involving aggressive behavior. About half an hour after the initial report of the tragic events at the Kramer home, the local police received another call that, at the time, seemed completely unrelated. A young man phoned in, clearly distressed and nearly in tears. He claimed someone was following him and that he was being chased in his car. The caller was a man named Jacob. Later, it was revealed that he had a history of emotional instability, including bouts of depression and anxiety. On its own, the call might have been dismissed as a false alarm, if not for one key detail. For the past couple of months, Jacob had been living with Johnny Borisov. After his breakup with Angela, Johnny didn't want to return to his parents' home, and he couldn't afford his own place. That's when he found a roommate to split the rent, Jacob. Jacob was soft-spoken, timid, and extremely impressionable. Raised in a strict religious household, he was used to following rules and being told what to do. From his teenage years, he had struggled with anxiety, numerous phobias, and depressive episodes, making him particularly susceptible to influence. Background checks showed that Jacob had never been in trouble with the law. People who knew him described him as quiet, polite, and somewhat withdrawn. Maybe a little strange, but not dangerous. While some suspected he may have been dealing with mental health issues or substance use, no one could say for sure. Interestingly, since there was no direct evidence or formal charges against Johnny, investigators could only bring him in for informal questioning, which meant he was free to leave or return at any time. During the interview, he kept stepping out to make phone calls and was constantly texting someone. This raised concerns among the detectives, so they filed for a warrant to examine his phone activity. As it turned out, Johnny had been calling and messaging someone saved in his contacts as Jay. That person was none other than Jacob, the same young man police had been trying to locate without success. The calls and texts didn't contain any direct, incriminating statements, but Johnny appeared to be trying to calm Jacob down, repeatedly telling him not to say anything that could cause problems. In recent years, Jacob had barely spoken to his parents and had been living with his grandparents before moving in with a roommate a couple of months prior. Authorities reached out to the elderly couple, but they hadn't heard from their grandson in some time. Jacob had told them he would visit soon, but never showed up or called back. His grandparents confirmed that Jacob had struggled with depression since he was young. At times, he experienced paranoia and had been treated at a mental health facility. However, despite these challenges, Jacob was resistant to medication. He believed he could manage his condition without it and often refused to take prescribed treatments. Jacob's family had long been wary of his new best friend. They believed Johnny was a bad influence and may have been taking advantage of him. But since both were adults living on their own, no one could intervene. As previously mentioned, Johnny had a history with law enforcement tied to the distribution of banned substances. After moving in with Jacob and learning about his mental health struggles, Johnny offered a different kind of solution. He encouraged Jacob to use certain psychoactive substances to cope. That's how Johnny got his roommate hooked on the very things he was selling. Jacob became dependent quickly. When he couldn't afford another dose, Johnny would offer it in exchange for favors. Over time, Jacob unknowingly became completely controlled by his so-called friend, a vulnerable young man manipulated by someone who clearly knew how to exploit weakness. A disturbing pattern began to emerge, and the suspicion around the two roommates grew stronger. It became increasingly likely that Johnny had orchestrated an act of revenge against his ex and her family, using Jacob as the one to carry it out. Emotionally unstable and struggling with addiction, Jacob might not have even fully understood what he was doing. Soon, another piece of the puzzle came to light. About a month before the triple crime, Jacob had legally purchased and registered a .40 caliber handgun. How someone with a history of mental health concerns was able to buy a firearm remains a mystery. Apparently, a thorough background check was not conducted, and he was sold a gun, supposedly for self-defense. This weapon was a match in model and caliber to the one used in the Kramer case, but a ballistics test was needed to confirm whether it was the same gun. Several other pieces of circumstantial evidence also pointed toward Jacob's involvement. But one big question remained: where was Jacob now? On March 4th, Jacob's worried parents contacted the police to report something unusual. For the first time in nearly 2.5 years, their son had unexpectedly shown up at their home. He seemed nervous, was acting strangely, and begged them to hide him, even if just for a little while. According to him, some gang members were after him, supposedly hired by the head of a local drug trafficking ring because he had failed some kind of mission. Jacob appeared to be under the influence of banned substances and was experiencing another episode of paranoia. He drew all the curtains, warned his parents not to go near the windows or answer any calls, and then went down to the basement, where he fell asleep on an old couch. By the time law enforcement arrived, Jacob had slept off some of the effects and was more coherent. He was taken in for questioning and shared a bizarre story, one he seemed to believe wholeheartedly. He asked only for one thing in return: that the police keep his parents safe from the so-called gangsters, and in exchange, he would confess everything. Jacob claimed it was Johnny who got him hooked on banned substances and who had been supplying them regularly. The problem, he said, was that he didn't always have money to pay, and his debts began to pile up. That's when Johnny allegedly told him he was connected to a powerful cartel, and that they were already aware of Jacob's unpaid balance. Worse, according to Jacob, Johnny insisted that his ex, Angela, had discovered his supposed ties to these dealers and was planning to expose him out of revenge. Jacob was told that the cartel's boss had found out about this and ordered her to be silenced, and that Jacob was expected to carry it out as payment for his debt. Jacob believed every word. He feared for his life and for the safety of his family. What he didn't know was that the cartel, the hit order, and the entire story had been made up. Johnny had fabricated the entire tale to manipulate Jacob into committing an act of revenge against Angela and her family. Under Johnny's influence, and in a state of paranoia, Jacob broke into the Kramer home by smashing a living room window. Almost immediately, he encountered Michael and his girlfriend asleep on the couch. Jacob chased them down and opened fire, taking Michael's life. The sound of the gunshots alerted Jeffrey and Lori upstairs, and they rushed out of their bedroom, only to be struck down on the staircase. After that, Jacob didn't come across any more family members. As panic set in, he fled the scene. At some point, convinced he was being chased by imaginary gang members for failing the task, he made a terrified call to emergency services. That call ended up being the breakthrough in the case. It gave investigators the lead they needed and helped them solve the crime in record time. Jacob eventually revealed where he had hidden the weapon used in the crime, along with the clothes he had worn that night. The evidence recovered, along with his confession, helped law enforcement reconstruct the entire sequence of events and confirm both his and Johnny's involvement in the triple crime. However, detectives decided to take a strategic approach, concerned that Johnny might try to shift blame or manipulate the legal process. They placed both suspects in the same interview room and told them to wait a few minutes for the investigator to return. Once alone, Johnny immediately started pressuring Jacob to take full responsibility, claiming that if he didn't, the gang members would go after his family. What Johnny didn't know was that the room was under audio and video surveillance. Every word he said was recorded, and that conversation confirmed everything investigators had suspected about his role in manipulating Jacob. Jacob ultimately agreed to a plea deal in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He was sentenced to 75 years in prison with no possibility of parole, effectively a life sentence. Johnny received the same fate, life behind bars with no chance for early release. Despite multiple attempts to appeal the decision, all of his efforts have so far been unsuccessful. Thanks for watching, everyone. Your support means a lot to me, and you can help my channel grow by hitting that like button, dropping a comment, and sharing this video. Your engagement really makes a difference. See you soon.